So I'm delighted to welcome David is Chief of Cardiology and Director of Cardiovascular Institute at the Loyola Medical School in Chicago, actually Maywood. And David has a long history in cardiac electrophysiology and has been really one of the luminaries and leaders in ablations and strategies of ablation, both as a clinician and as a teacher. He's been very involved in all of electrophysiology activities, Heart Rhythm Society, and their educational activities, and many other things. And is an international leader in interventional electrophysiology. So we're very happy to have you, David, with us. David received his MD, correct me if I'm wrong, from Northwestern University. I think his undergraduate degree from medicine. And then I think continued his education in Ann Arbor, had a little sometime in Boston at Mass General. Then University of Chicago, the family in Loyola, and came to visit us from Chicago, where it's minus 10 degrees.
So I came south for better weather. Well, thanks for having me. I've had a pleasurable day, and even though we couldn't reverse the Bears' misfortune, I have to say, I guess I couldn't have expected a whole lot different from that, but I've had an extremely pleasant visit. I've talked with many of you and learned an awful lot about what's going on here in St. Louis in terms of cardiology and cardiac electrophysiology. So thanks for your time. Hopefully in return, I'll share a little bit of some of our interests. This is going to be a fairly clinically based talk, and looking at one of the things that I've been interested in for many years is looking at substrate ablation for ventricular tachycardia, and share with you a bit of what we've learned and hopefully where things are going. So many of you are aware of much of the data here. If we talk about sort of what the substrate of post-MI-BT is, we know that it starts with surviving muscle fibers that are encased in collagen, and these encased fibers are often connected more side to side than end to end, and is very nicely described by DeBacker and others in the last couple of decades. One has this zigzag pattern of side-to-side conduction that results in a relatively long path length, and oftentimes that long path length is part of the reason for the apparent slow conduction. And that in fact you often have relatively normal action potentials, at least relatively late post-MI, although there's certainly some recent data that suggests in animal models early after infarction there is ion channel remodeling, and there are regional reductions in the sodium current and probably in the L-type calcium current. It's not clear how those relate to infarct now 10 or 20 years later, but it does certainly happen early on. We know that both acutely and chronically there's a reorganization of gap junctions, and they're changed not only spatially, and again the increased side-to-side connections, but there's functional alterations in remaining gap junctions as well. And all of this produces asynchronous delayed activation in sinus rhythm and slow conduction during BT. So these are the things. Interestingly, and I know this is a subject that Yoram's very interested and involved in, is if you model many of these things in systems that have some of the properties that we know to be true of biological systems, if you reduce the sodium channel current, or reduce the number of gap junctions, or increase the amount of fibrosis by as much as 50%, none of these things, at least in relatively normal hearts, produce terribly slow conduction. And so clearly there are other things that involve the infarcted heart and a combination of these factors that produce slow conduction. And conceptually, these are, again, some pictures taken, photomicrographs taken from the work of DeBacker. This was a papillary muscle, and in this case, the dark represents scar, and this lightish rim here represents surviving myocardium. And what you can see here actually is the subendocardial surviving fibers, and there are bits of fibrosis and collagen that separate these into separate muscle bundles, and this is a typical surviving subendocardial layer for human infarction. And it is one of the things to remember when we do animal models and the kinds of things that we extrapolate back to human VTs, that in fact much of the surviving myocardium, the surviving fibers, is subendocardial rather than the subepicardial sheets that we find much easier to study in animal models. Not that the lessons aren't necessarily comparable, but they're clearly different. The other thing, though, to remember is that it's not always simply surviving subendocardial fibers, but in fact, and this gets back to that sort of patchy side-to-side, end-to-end, when you do careful morphometric studies, so this is a chunk from a human heart, this is a posterior infarction, and this line here now, this is blown up, and so this is a carefully sliced from endocardium to epicardium and in multiple layers and multiple thicknesses. And what you see here, this black is surviving muscle, this is connective tissue. And you can see in the endocardium there's this incredibly complex pattern of interdigitated, zigzagging fibers. So in fact, it's not quite as simple as a surviving subendocardial layer, but a very complex branching pattern, which is subendocardial, but also mid-myocardial, and to a lesser extent epicardial. We'll talk about that in a minute, a bit more later. So clearly these surviving fibers and their interconnections form those slow conduction channels that we want to identify during an ablation session and target. There are lots of issues with this, though, that make this a challenge, and certainly that from surgical and catheter studies, we know that the VT circuits, for at least human VT, are not small. Oftentimes they're on the order of several centimeters in dimensions, and we talk about micro-reentry, but in fact, of tachycardias that apparently come from a relatively focal source, but in fact, the majority of VTs that we can map clinically, and that's an important statement because obviously if you can get detailed mapping in stable VT, that doesn't mean that for a much more fast VT that in fact that data is always the same. But if you look at VTs that you can map either in the OR or in the clinical lab, the circuits are very large. There are discrete protected areas that form a slow conduction channel that seem to be insulated from the surrounding myocardia, either anatomically by fibrosis, but sometimes also functionally, and that's important because if they're functional, it means the properties are apparent only during VT and not necessarily during sinus rhythm. But due to either one of these, in fact, this is the channel that you want to identify. This is sort of a simple conceptual model, in this case of a two-dimensional series of surviving fibers that are interconnected through the scar, and this would be our putative area of slow conduction. There are a lot of challenges in clinical VT, however. We know that the vast majority of patients have multiple different forms of VT, so multiple morphologies, and most of these aren't hemodynamically stable, so in fact you can't carefully map them, and so if we're going to cure VT, then we can't rely on mapping during VT for the vast majority of these. Since there are many morphologies, in fact it appears that several of these have shared areas of slow conduction, and so that the apparent change on the ECG is due to different exits from the same slow conduction channel. So there's not necessarily for each ECG pattern a unique area of slow conduction. But these slow conduction channels may be relatively broad, and I'll show you some pictures of those in a minute. And they can have functional boundaries, so they may not be present during sinus rhythm. And obviously then some of these may also be, as we talked about, mid-myocardial or epicardial. So one of the things that's helped us immensely in the EP lab is to be able to define the scar in vivo. And you are aware of many sort of techniques now that can be done, certainly with MR and CT. Obviously, these are not easily translatable to the EP lab, but one of the things that seems to be useful is voltage. And if you look at subendocardial voltage, it's generally related to the amount of surviving scar, and this is just an animal study from the Philadelphia laboratory, but there are many such. And this is a color-coded map, electroanatomical mapping. For those of you who aren't familiar with it, is simply having a catheter that has a magnetic chip in it. There's three magnetic fields of different strength generated underneath the patient that are sensed by this catheter floating around in space, and it basically can triangulate the position of the catheter in a three-dimensional space and build a virtual shell, if you will, of the endocardium or any chamber that you're mapping. And that, in fact, is what's here, and it does also then capture the voltage. and you can display the voltage as color-coded from red being the lowest voltage to purple being relatively high voltage. And in this case, they looked at both pathological infarct size and the intracardiac echo defined akinetic areas, another way of saying how big the scar is, and finding that somewhere between 1 and 2 millivolts was a reasonable reflector of scar. And so one can take this, and there's been a fairly large literature now looking at voltage as a way of correlating with scar, and people have looked at correlation with histopathology and suggested that somewhere between 1.5 and 2.5 millivolts is what correlates with the histologic size of scar, whether it's TTT staining or a variety of other things. You can do functional assessment looking at the area that's akinetic or the area that has absent perfusion. Again, relatively similar cutoffs. And then finally, one can characterize normal myocardium statistically. Just take lots of patients that have normal hearts and say what's 95 percentile of normal voltage, and in fact it's around 1.5 millivolts is what you come up with. So there's a lot of lines of data that suggest, although there's probably some overlap and it's not perfect, and I'll tell you some of the reasons why that is, that a 1.5 millivolt isopotential line is a fairly useful way of defining what scar is. And so if one generates this three-dimensional volume and then puts color-coded endocardial voltage on it, you can get a reasonable reproduction of what the endocardial scar should look like.
You got bipolar voltage.
It's bipolar voltage, and that's actually important because there have been a lot of studies looking at both bipolar and unipolar voltage, and although the interventionalists favored unipolar voltage in the early days of doing scar identification for interventional stem cell therapy and a variety of things, the bipolar voltage probably correlates much better. In fact, there are a whole number of things. One can use impedance, for example. You can give a low-level electrical signal, and myocardial impedance is actually relatively, is also altered by scar, and so you can do an impedance map. But bipolar voltage is probably still the best, and it seems to be better than unipolar voltage in terms of correlating.
So are these numbers that you give here, are they the mean voltage over time, or?
Yeah, this, you mean time, meaning time from scar, infarction, or?
Or when you put your catheter in and you record a signal, if you had an ECG, it would be time varying.
Well, yeah, this is the activation time. So this is voltage at the time of activation. It's the maximum voltage. Okay. And so it's at the time of systole in most of these. And I'll show you a little bit about the signals in a minute. So it's generally been accepted that the 1.5 millivolt is a reasonable reflector of scar. Maybe actually, we've done some animal studies that suggest if you're counting subendocardial infarction, in fact, it may actually be up to 2 millivolts or so. But this is probably reason for clinical studies. We've considered the border zone to be 0.5 to 1.5 millivolts, relatively arbitrary, and dense scar to be less than 0.5 millivolts. Some rationale for this is as the voltage goes down, voltage doesn't just reflect the immediate subendocardial area, but even the bipolar signal is somewhat influenced by the depth of myocardium, so that voltage that's less than 0.5 is more likely to be transmural. One of the problems, though, with calling anything that's low voltage as being dense or dead scar is that, in fact, you can have some really tiny strands of myocardium that have very low voltage signals as low as 0.03 millivolts or so 50 microvolts, that in fact are still viable, and you can demonstrate that by being able to paste the scar at these low voltage sites and capturing it. So one has to be careful, and so although we use these as general markers of the scar, you got to be careful about whether that really, it doesn't completely correlate with viability. It's certainly important that when you do this that you get a dense sampling, because obviously if one doesn't sample very densely, you can really certainly misrepresent the size of the scar. It's important to have adequate electrode contact. If you're recording, you're going to get a low voltage signal if the catheter is hanging out in the middle of the air. And one of the things you can do is look at the electrogram duration. In general, scar tissue with low voltage also has relatively wide electrograms. And so if you get a low voltage electrogram that's narrow, odds are you're really just not making good tissue contact. This is important, and it also depends to some extent on the direction of activation. So voltage depends on sometimes whether the wavefront is traveling with the bipole parallel or perpendicular to the wavefront, and you'll get somewhat different results, for example, in sinus rhythm versus ventricular pacing. It turns out that these are somewhere in the range of 20% or so changes in amplitude and don't affect the scar definition that much if you look at scar area sort of thing. So one can probably use paced or sinus rhythm voltages to construct a scar map with relatively equal accuracy. There is some difference on the nature of the electrograms that we'll talk about in a minute. So obviously all of this is going to be helped when we have good spatial resolution with MR and CT, which we really don't have now. I think to look at transmurality and voltage and again readdress some of these issues. We'd love to be able to have these available to define scar, but I'm not sure that they're of sufficient quality to do that now. This is just another animal study that looked at the correlation of transmurality with voltage, and as you can see, as one gets to electrogram bipolar voltages under 1.5 to 1, somewhere around 70 to 80% of the transmural of the infarct wall, or rather the muscle wall, is involved in the scar. So there is, even with bipolar electrograms, some influence of how dense the scar is. These are, I think, important things when one's talking about giving lesions that can make as much as a centimeter or so in depth and a centimeter in width, which is what an irrigated tip catheter can do. You want to make sure you're mostly dead myocardium at the time that you do that, and you're just targeting surviving strands of myocardium. Otherwise, one can do a fair amount of damage to patients who already have limited functional reserve. Okay, questions about that at all? So I think the whole concept of using voltage for scar definition is evolving, but there's at least on the endocardium for bipolar voltage, this is fairly worked out. Well, so that's one way of defining the substrate. So now we have an in vivo way to take the patient to the lab and we can define the scar, but we want to know some other things about the scar that can help us hone in a bit more on what are likely to be arrhythmogenic sites. And one of the ways to do that is look at the characteristics of the electrogram. And this is certainly data that's been known for 30 years. Mark Joseph's in the very early days in the late 70s, authored several studies that suggested that the electrograms from scars were fractionated and had relatively long durations. There are some very specific things, though, that we're interested in terms of identifying pathways, these slow conduction channels in sinus rhythm. And these are isolated potentials. And one can often see these, and really these are just two components, typically. When they're very short coupling, and if they're separated, the sort of typical definition is a separation by at least 20 milliseconds. When they're coupled relatively early like this, these are quite common. And you can see these in as much as 50% of scar sites. So what does this represent? It certainly represents asynchronous activation. Whether it means anything more than that, it simply means that there are two fibers that or they're muscle bundles that are activated in distinct spatial sequence. What's probably more interesting are these potentials that are now can be single or multiple and occur considerably after the offset of the QRS, so relatively late in diastole. And these again are relatively low voltage. You can see this marker is about 0.1 millivolts, so these are about 0.05 millivolt signals, typically, or even less. And that these are very late afterwards, and they again suggest that this is when the bulk of myocardium is activating, and now this is in the range of 200 to 300 to 400 milliseconds later. So activated very late in sinus rhythm, and I'll show you some pictures about where that comes from. So these are interesting potentials, and these are candidates for indicating an area of slow conduction during BT. In other words, if these are present during sinus rhythm, it stands to reason that they may also be part of a slow conduction channel during BT, or at least it's a testable hypothesis. People also talk about fractionated electrograms, which are these low amplitude and relatively long signals, typically more than 100 milliseconds or so, that extend after the termination of the QRS. If you simply talk about late potentials, those that happen after the end of the QRS, they're probably not as interesting as these isolated diastolic potentials that are actually separate from the QRS and are not part of this continuous activation and occur relatively late. And those may be a bit more specific for slow conduction zones that we identified during BT, and I'll show you some examples of that in a minute. Well, if you just took all those, so this is now the maps that we generate. So this is a patient with a very big anterior apical scar, and you can see, in fact, more of the heart is scar than surviving myocardium, so this is the normal muscle. The red is less than 0.5, so relatively dense scar, and then you can see these areas in between, which represent bordered voltage. You also see all of these pink dots, which represent these very late potentials, delayed asynchronous activation. Could these be channels that are now being activated from the borders of the scar, slow conduction in BT, and potentially sites of slow conduction during BT? Well, you can instantly see one problem. If we believe that, we'd want to use the elimination of these double potentials as one way of ablating BT. We've got a lot of work to do. There's an awful lot of these channels there, and so if one doesn't have some other way of making this more specific, this is an awful lot of targets. So just to go on about the diastolic potentials a little bit more, because I think the story is interesting, and it's very clear if you take a group of patients that have a scar but have never had VT, and you take a group of patients that have spontaneous VT, that in fact, in the people who have spontaneous VT, you're much more likely to find these diastolic potentials, at least twice or three times the frequency. So that's certainly something that says that these diastolic potentials play a role. As you saw in the previous picture, these are present in both dense scar and on the scar border. But if you look at patients with spontaneous VT, there's a huge variability in frequency and duration. It can be as many as 1% of the scar sites or 30% of the scar sites. And so it doesn't necessarily, the sort of absolute percentage of the scar that has these doesn't seem to be very helpful. It seems to be more common in anteroseptal scars rather than in posterior scars, even when you adjust for ejection fraction and clinical functional class and those sorts of variables, and suggest that there may be different ways that these infarcts remodel over time. Probably one of the most interesting things about clinical VT is that it can occur as many as 20 or 30 years after the initial myocardial infarction. So one of the things that's interesting about the VTs, even that we see in the EP lab today, is they're still a result of patients who had their scars before we did reperfusion therapy. So one of the things that we've talked about how scars evolve, and as you know, we now get in and intervene and open up vessels, and that certainly affects how scars heal and how they're remodeled. Interestingly, many of the scars we're still currently dealing with now, in terms of VT at least, reflect a time before reperfusion happened, and it's not uncommon to wait 10, 15, or 20 years before you have your first episode of VT. Interestingly, there's some preliminary data that suggests that the duration of lateness of these diastolic potentials, the percentage and the number and how late they are, is actually correlated to the age of the scar. And suggests, again, there may be some interesting connection to these late potentials and why VT happens. Now, whether this happens in more contemporary scars, because what happens in our current process of myocardial infarction? We still see plenty of EFs that are 10%, but now we see them as a result of, the stent closed and got reopened. And so we see stuttering little infarctlets rather than the grand occlusion. And so one does wonder, how does that affect the way the scar heals and remodels? And that's one of the things I think that we still need to sort out over the next few years to understand who's at risk of having VT episodes and who isn't. So this is one more interesting little bit of information, and this is really old data. And what it suggested was, although remember I said to some extent the scar voltage depends upon the transmurality of the infarct, it's very clear that these potentials represent still relatively local activation. And the reason is that if you go into surgery and peel off the endocardial scar layer, all these late potentials go away. So they're relatively superficial on the endocardial surface, and that's not surprising, right? Because remember, we saw the primary mode for clinical VT, the primary substrate is subendocardial surviving muscle fibers. And in fact, so here's an example from surgery where this was during ventricular tachycardia. You see all these late potentials during ventricular tachycardia. Here's some sinus rhythm. And you can see, in fact, these late potentials, these potentials which preceded activation during VT are now very late in sinus rhythm. So this is all on the apical septum. Now they peeled that off and put the patch back on the deeper layer of myocardium to the left, and all those diastolic potentials are gone. Just another piece that says these are important in terms of identifying areas of conduction delay. Well, again, why all the fuss? Why is that interesting? Because we see this phenomenon fairly frequently. So these are during sinus rhythm, and you see this very low amplitude late potential. Now you leave the catheter there, start up VT, and now you have a very delayed fractionated signal that's more than 100 milliseconds prior to QRS onset. And when one does a variety of pacing maneuvers, you demonstrate that this is part of the circuit of VT. And if you turn on radio frequency energy there, VT stops, and during sinus rhythm, this potential is gone. So you can do this over and over again for stable VT. And it turns out that, in fact, in a couple of studies that have been done looking at slow, stable VT, if you induce VT, you find these kind of electrograms, stop the VT, you'll see these late potentials in sinus rhythm. So that suggests this is a fairly sensitive, at least, sign for, in sinus rhythm, of the area of slow conduction, the slow conduction channel. The problem is it's not very specific. And you can, as you saw in that map from a couple of slides ago, these are all over the endocardial surface of many of the scars. And many of these simply signify dead-end pathways, areas that are, if you will, sort of bystanders that will never participate in tachycardia. So what can you do to make it more specific so you don't have to ablate to have the scar in order to get rid of VT? Well, one thing you can do is, one of the correlates has been very long delays. So the later the potential, the more likely you are that this participates in VT. And interestingly, in some of the studies that have targeted diastolic potentials for VT, they found their success is less in those that the longest late potential they could find was relatively short. So another bit of evidence that you really want long delays in order to represent an area of slow conduction during VT. You can also do pace mapping. If you pace map in sinus rhythm and it looks just like the VT morphology, then that suggests, again, you're in a relatively constrained anatomically determined pathway, and that, in fact, and that improves the specificity of this finding for slow conduction channel during VT. Well, we've taken a little different tact, and we're also sort of interested in the geometry of reentrant circuits, if you will, as they relate to scars, and again, how that may tell us what we can do to ablate VT in sinus rhythm. And so this is just another electroanatomical map. This is activation now during VT. So in this case, red is very early, purple is very late, and red and purple meet. And for the mappers in here that use that, when activation spans the entire cardiac cycle, then you're certainly very suspicious of a large reentrant circuit. In this case, it's a figure of 8 in that it goes, one limb goes around this way, one limb goes around this way. You can, by pacing maneuvers, and I'm not going to bother to go into this in great detail now, determine which aspects of the circuit perform which role by pacing maneuvers. And one can, for example, define these slow conduction channels by their response to pacing. So I won't go into that in great detail, but in fact, this area here, this relatively narrow channel, this is about 1 centimeter. And as we talked about before, these can be as wide as 2 or 3 centimeters or relatively narrow. This central slow conduction channel is what we see, and then now as you get out and break out on both sides, these actually appear to be, some of these are bystander sites and some of these are called outer loop sites, which means they're no longer in a protected isthmus. The gist of this, though, is that when we now look at this map and compare it to the scar borders, what we see is the exit site of the area of slow conduction is always near the scar border. that in fact the isthmus, the central isthmus, is usually located either perpendicular or tangential to the scar border. And if you pace in sinus rhythm, you can reproduce the morphology of the VT. The vast majority, virtually all of these patients in whom you can find a central isthmus, you can pace at the exit site. In sinus rhythm, you can reproduce the VT morphology. So what have we learned? So what does this suggest? Well, it suggests that what's a simple way of ablating VT? Well, if you can pace around the scar border, find matches for the induced VT, and ablate in a way that transects that isthmus. So how do you do that? It's got to be parallel to the scar border. That in fact should be a reasonable strategy for ablating VT. So just to add to this a little bit more, here's another patient with a big anteroapical scar. These are the electrograms during sinus rhythm. This is at the scar border. You can see that during sinus rhythm, here's the main potential coincident with the activation of the QRS. This is a relatively late potential. And here's another, actually, a second late potential. During VT, you now see reversal of these potentials with more delay. So what's happened is during sinus rhythm, you're activating from normal to scar, and then during VT, you're obviously going the opposite way. And here's the central isthmus. We're now deeper into the scar. We also see two late potentials. During VT, these are reversed. So now instead of activating from inside out, you're going, or rather from outside in, you're going inside out during VT. And these potentials are reversed. Again, the relationship between these late potentials during sinus rhythm and during VT. Now, fortunately, these are all two-dimensional circuits. They're on the endocardial surface. And remember that some of these, not all of them work out this nicely. But again, when we pace at the scar border, we exactly reproduce the VT morphology, and in fact, making a linear lesion that incorporates this Paceman match and parallel to the scar border, eliminated inducibility of this VT. So this is a relatively, another option, another relatively simple and straightforward method for targeting these VTs. Again, that's just an example of that. The mitral annulus turns out to be sort of interesting, and it's an interesting barrier, and the circuits are a little bit different. Some time ago, we sort of found that these tachycardias often occurred in pairs, and you've got an area of slow conduction that it was parallel to the mitral annulus instead of perpendicular to it. So this is the one, if you consider the mitral annulus to be a scar border, this is the one exception. And in this case, the area of slow conduction is parallel rather than tangential to the scar border. And in fact, one can pace map, and one usually gets, when you get activation toward the septum, you get a left bundle VT, when you get an activation toward the free wall, you get a right bundle VT. And the important thing to understand about these anatomically is that in order to prevent these VTs, you have to make a linear lesion perpendicular to the mitral annulus to interrupt these slow conduction channels. And overall, when we did this in 35 VTs, in 91% we could identify an exit site that was within 1.5 centimeters of the scar border. All of these had excellent Paceman matches in sinus rhythm. The orientation is what we discussed, and in fact, about 2/3 of the time we could find these late potentials around the scar border. This is just some work by the Philadelphia lab that actually found something relatively similar, that of all the VTs that they could map by entrainment, so slow, stable VTs, 92% of them had their endocardial exit site in the scar border, within regions of scar, in the border flow-through zone regions. So it says this is where we can narrow our hunt, so we're no longer ablating in the whole scar, but narrowing our hunt to the area of the scar border. And in fact, the vast majority of times, then that's where we'll find the exit site. So we can take this data now and say that there's several approaches we can take to VT ablation. We can try to target these channels in deep scar. I'll talk a little bit about a couple of the methods. Or we can try to target the channel exit sites. And for a variety of reasons, there may be some times when one is more reasonable than another to do. So this is just something that was introduced by Bill Stevenson, and it's just a refinement on the concept of mapping the scar by voltage. So remember we said that one of the problems with voltage alone is that even though in general low voltage means transmural scar, you still get some surviving fibers on the subendocardium, and sometimes those can be important in VT. So you can use pacing as an additional corroborator of viability, and therefore find areas, and these black areas here are areas where they paced and couldn't capture the myocardium at all, even at maximum output. So that's really dead tissue. In fact, there's nothing viable there. And what they found is that when you found a couple of these, usually the critical isthmus was between those areas of inexcitability. And in fact, they could pace and produce a stimulus to QRS that was relatively long and a QRS morphology that reproduced the VT, and suggested that this method of identifying totally electrically unexcitable areas would help you find a channel in between, and if you connected those two together, that you could interrupt the VT. Again, it's a reasonable technique. It just means you got to pace at every site that you sample. And so that's obviously a pacing threshold map is a difficult thing to do, but certainly as an adjunct could be useful. You can look at the isolated diastolic potentials, and we've sort of talked about that a lot, so I don't need to mention that anymore. There have been a couple of groups that have used this as a primary method for ablating VT and have reported fairly good success in the rate of 80% elimination of all VT over follow-up and a substantial reduction in VT recurrences in the remainder. And then finally, there is sort of the method that we've probably used more than any of the others, which is simply the scar border ablation. And this is really based both upon some of the physiology that we talked about and also just the extension of the surgeon's experience, much of which certainly was here in St. Louis. One can do either endocardial resection or there was actually endocardial incision or cryoablation around the scar borders. And sometimes this was coupled with regionalizing the areas of interest by pacing or doing a variety of other things. And patients had excellent long-term outcomes with very low rates of postoperative inducibility. Obviously, the problem with VT surgical ablation was the issue of having to open the heart and poor pump function postoperatively for many of these patients and a relatively substantial mortality. But nonetheless, this concept of ablating along the scar border and doing linear ablation inside the scar really had been validated previously in surgery. And so our method for approaching this is, and we've sort of taken the idea that basically anybody that has ICD shocks is a candidate for ablation, although we find a huge referral bias. And the interesting thing is that if you look at the patients who were referred for VT ablation 10 years ago and the patients who are referred for VT ablation now, the people now are much sicker, much closer to death's door, if you will, before they get referred for ablation. And it's really because of the ICD. So physicians have an enormous tolerance for patient shocks, much more so than patients do. And so one of the things is that you'll see patients referred for ablation that have literally hundreds of shocks before someone's considered referring them for ablation, and they've failed multiple antiarrhythmic drugs. It's not a minor issue in the sense that there's actually some data that shocks contribute to mortality, and that in fact, and so does antiarrhythmic drug therapy. So although the ICDs have certainly had a substantial impact on survival overall, patients who have frequent shocks, their mortality is markedly accelerated. And clearly what we've done to manage these patients has not been good, and we need a change in strategy. So I'm going to present some data when we finish up that I hope will be a little provocative and perhaps stimulate some of you to maybe rethink how we approach VT ablation. So anyway, our approach is that if a patient has multiple shocks, whether it's due to fast VT, slow VT, we don't worry about it. We simply take the approach that we induce the VTs in the lab. Generally, patients have an average of 4 or 5 different morphologies. We'll generate a map in sinus rhythm. If a patient has a mappable VT, we'll map it and we'll do the traditional entrainment mapping and activation mapping, although that's not terribly common. Once we've generated the voltage map, we'll pace around the scar border and tag all the matches to the VTs that we have. As you can imagine, that's a little laborious if you've got 5 different VTs and you pace all around. You've got to compare these. One has a lab that looks like somebody's writing the last night before the term papers do. And one of the things that's been very helpful is to we now have some automated methods for actually doing the pace mapping and comparing them, so we can get relatively quick matches. And I'll show you that in a minute. So once we've found these matches to all the induced VTs, then we give linear ablations along the scar border. This is a sort of typical referral population we have now. Elderly, relatively sick, over half are class 3 or 4. The vast majority have failed amiodarone. Most have had actually some attempt at prior ablation even, so it's a relatively sick population. And they've had an average of, they have about 4 VTs. And 91% of the patients had at least one unstable VT, and about half, they're all unstable and so can't be mapped conventionally. And this is just an example of what we do. And so this is the scar, big anteapical scar. The patient had 3 different VTs. We paced around the scar border at a variety of sites, and these were the 3 that produced the best matches. And these are then radiofrequency linear lesions that are applied inside the scar border. We want to be a relatively dense scar when we do this again, not sort of in this area of more viable myocardium again, because we don't want to sacrifice what remaining function people have. And in this particular patient, after those 3 sets of linear lesions, non-inducible, and has had no subsequent shocks.
David, that picture, I'm trying to get a picture. I can tell where the apex is.
Oh, it's, the apex is right here. So this is actually a straight AP view.
Right.
So this is the apex. Excuse me?
How far up is the base? Is the whole heart included in that?
Yeah, this is the whole heart. So this is the AP view of the heart. So this is actually, the scar includes, it goes almost all the way to the base, about 3 centimeters. So it's a huge anteapical infarct. And actually, you can just see this is, we sometimes use intracardiac echo, and this just kind of defines the hinge point where the myocardium narrows, and again, that just shows that that's very near the scar border for these patients. And this is a patient with a large inferior infarct, so this is in the RAO view. This is in the inferior view, so you're looking up from below. And in this case, again, 3 different morphologies. And you can see these are where the linear lesions are made along the septal scar border, along the lateral scar border, and then one more apically. And in fact, in this particular case, again, the patient non-inducible and has had no subsequent shocks. So we've done this now in about 110 patients, and about 80% are non-inducible, many DT afterwards. There's been no change in left ventricular systolic function, again, because we look at paired echoes before discharge, and it shouldn't be surprising since you're mostly ablating in scar. We did have a procedure-related death. The patient died due to a VT that we were unable to terminate, and he died a couple of days after the procedure. And that's been the only death. There's been no TIAs or strokes in the population, and I think that's probably attributable to the, we use an irrigated tip catheter, which open irrigation, which I think has been shown in a couple of studies now to decrease the risk of stroke and TIA. So although this was early on in my training a significant risk with catheter ablation, I think is really not a concern now. And about half of the patients had their antiarrhythmic drugs stopped, and the rest are on generally a low dose of amiodarone. And overall, over the 2-year follow-up, about 78% have not had any further VT, and of the remaining, there's been a dramatic reduction in the pre-ablation mean episodes of 27 per month to 0.4 or 0.1 per month afterwards. So I think what these data show is that substrate-based ablation clearly have, even in an incredibly sick population of patients that have relatively advanced disease, has a significant impact on VT frequency. And for many of these VTs, they literally are, for many of these patients, extremely sick, advanced heart failure, and have had lots of VT episodes for up to a year prior to them being referred for ablation. want to give you just a couple of examples to give you a little bit more flavor for the sorts of things that we do. And this is a sort of a typical case of a 72-year-old man who had a big anterior infarct and nearly 10%. Had been treated with amiodarone and other drugs in multiple combinations. And finally, after having sort of a low level of a few shocks every month, had 10 shocks in the preceding week and he referred for ablation. Interestingly, he had several different rates, and I think the thing that's interesting here is that they're all the same morphology. It's just at various times they're anywhere between a cycle length of 400 and a cycle length of 290. Unfortunately, the only one that you got at the BP study was the really fast one, so it wasn't anything like that. And so what does that suggest when you have that? Well, it suggests you have the same morphology with multiple different rates. So what's likely? There's a common exit and there's loops of varying lengths more than likely that are feeding into that. When we did pacing, we found two areas. This is again the mitral valve annulus. You're looking at the REO view. This is the scar here, big anterior infarct. These two dots here, white dots, represent good Paceman matches to this. So a somewhat larger area than usual that gave you good Paceman maps. We simply made a relatively long lesion here. And after that was done, we could no longer induce these VTs. However, we did induce something else, and even faster. And one can argue, and people argue about these sorts of things. This is a non-clinical VT. Should you go home and not do anymore? In our experience, any VT that you can induce is possible to recur. And so when we send these people home, if you leave unablated VTs, you're still more likely to have recurrences. And so in this case, what it told us we needed to do was to keep mapping around the scar border. And in this case, you can see there's an inferior axis, so it's got to come from relatively high. The transition zone is very late, so it's more likely to be a basal VT. So where might you predict that this is going to be? If you were to choose some place around that scar, where would you pace? Well, we thought it would be somewhere around the superior mitral annulus, and in fact, so we pasted this spot here. In fact, that exactly reproduced the VT, and made another linear lesion here. After that, the patient is not inducible. So sometimes you have to do these things a bit sequentially, and our goal is to render patients not inducible whenever we can. This is another gentleman who had an inferior MI, and this was his clinical VT. So when we see a left bundle VT, we think that it usually comes from the septum. So since most VTs are left ventricular in origin, so that's what we think this might come from. But when this is now looking up from below, this is again normal, this is scar. And so we've paced all around the scar. All these green dots are pace maps, and we could never reproduce the VT morphology no matter what we did. It kind of looked like it in some. So what should we do? Those of you who are the clinicians, what should we do? We got a left bundle VT, we can't match it to the scar on the side. What else could give you left bundle? The other ventricle, right? So we just don't think about it much. And in fact, here was there was a little scar in the RV apex, and in fact exactly reproduced the morphology of this VT, and made a little linear lesion near the scar there, and the patient's done fine since. And so occasionally, about 10% of the time, the ischemic VTs come from the right ventricle, and you have to look at the right ventricle just as you would during mapping studies to try to relate. And finally, there's another gentleman who had ICD shocks, and he'd been through the whole thing and had amiodarone hyperthyroidism, and now was on clofazimide and mixolotine, and still had trouble, and had an EF of 28%. He had part cabbage and grafts and a large apical aneurysm. And this was his VT. It was fast and nasty, and again, very hemodynamically unstable. Kind of a bizarre action potential like morphology. So this was his map, and big now septal scar, lateral wall looks pretty healthy. We did pace mapping all over the place, and we got this match that wasn't so hot. It looked pretty good, but the one thing we could never get was this strange sort of shelf, this long delayed onset of activation in the anterior cortical lead. So we tried to do a linear ablation along the best Paceman matches we had, which was on the apical portion of the scar. But that didn't remove the VT. So what's possible here? One of the things that when you get very delayed, almost delta wave-like activation in the anterior cortical leads is that it can be potentially epicardial infarction. About 10% of the time it is. Unfortunately, although we can often approach these by a subxiphoid percutaneous approach, and you're probably familiar with the SOSA technique for mapping and approaching the epicardial space, when patients have a previous myocardial infarction, there's extensive, and CABG, there's extensive scarring, epicardial adhesion, and we have this huge apical aneurysm. It's very hard to get around to the lateral wall. So in this case, we have our surgeons come down and do a lateral thoracotomy. You can make the same kind of thing you might do to expose a mini thoracotomy to put a KaSing lead in on the left ventricle when you can't successfully place a venous left ventricular pacing lead. We can do this here, and we actually do this in the EP lab simply because we no longer have all of the stuff in the OR to do surgical mapping much anymore. It's not very common. And so we do this in the EP lab, and here we have an epicardial map, and you can see a couple of things that are interesting. The epicardial scar is much less than the endocardial scar, and that's very typical for ischemic VTs. And generally, epicardial scar is less. It's actually a little different oriented. This is now, there's a relatively sharp division between the more septal side and the more lateral side here. Whereas in this patient, the scar is more inferior and extends a little more laterally on the epicardial surface than it does on the cardial. And it turned out where we had to ablate, this is where we got the best Paceman match from. We got that strange little shelf in the anterior cortical leads and made a linear lesion at this area here. We could no longer reduce the VT. So we do have to go to the epicardium, but it doesn't happen very often in ischemics, and so we tend to do that as our last resort when nothing else works. It's very different for non-ischemic cardiomyopathy, where as much as half of the VT comes from the epicardium. And in that case, we generally start with epicardial mapping very early. Okay. And then finally, you get the problem that, and it's why you kind of have to be flexible and understand all the approaches. This was a patient who had lots of ICD shocks and a cycle rate of 350. We had no 12 leads, so we couldn't do pace mapping around the scar border, and we couldn't induce the VT in the EP lab. So what are you going to do? You're going to go home, going to let him have his shocks. So what we did was, again, did a map of the right ventricle. So this is looking up from below. So this is the RV inferior view. This is the LV inferior view. If you looked at the scar with the 1.5 isopotential line, this would have been his inferior scar. We sort of manipulated the voltage filter to see whether or not we could find areas within the scar that were higher voltage, perhaps more viable. And we saw this interesting channel here, and when you looked in the middle of that channel, there was the only latent potential that we could find in the entire scar. So that was the point that we ablated, and unfortunately the patients had no further shocks since that time. So there are a variety of ways that one can approach this. You can target, we think it's easiest to do pace mapping around the scar border when you know the VT morphology. If you don't, you can target diastolic potentials in the scar. They both have their limitations. If you look at series that have done both, in the end you kind of give the same number of radiofrequency lesions. And it may be that there are simply some patients, like those with inferior scars, who have very few late diastolic potentials, and so you really can't use that method, except in this case where the one spot he had, it turned out to be probably the right spot. I think we were just lucky, more than anything else for the patient was lucky, I should say. So where's all this going to go? And I think this is the future for VT ablation. Really would like to image MR and CT and use those scans, bring them in, look at the scar in sufficient detail. We ought to theoretically be able to tell if the scar is transmural, if it's endocardial, epicardial, all those things. I don't know that we can do that with sufficient precision right now. but we ought to be able to bring these into the EP lab and have that serve as the template for our mapping. So that's certainly one goal. I think that's ultimately going to happen. Again, we're working on some ways to make the pace mapping easy. So you can store the VTs when you have them. You do a pace map and it automatically compares it to all the induced VTs and says this is a 99% correlation of late here. We're making some progress on that. There are some interesting computer algorithms. There are some other properties of the scar. People, Ed Chicaccio in Columbia has had some interesting observations about the duration of the sinus rhythm electrogram, the order of activation that lets him predict where slow conduction channels are in sinus rhythm. And it may be that, in fact, one can design computer algorithms. They've done this in a small number of patients where they were able to predict, based on sinus rhythm activation characteristics, where the slow conduction channel was going to emerge. So that's a potential application. And clearly, much of the information that Yoram's been working on, the approach of electrocardiograph and non-invasive imaging, although much of it may be to supplant invasive studies, I see this as a tremendous aid for helping us localize VT. I think that this has some interesting applications in terms of, and we talked a little bit today about looking at transmurality and how we might decide what that is, because there are some differences between epicardial and endocardial scar, but nonetheless I think this offers a very interesting way of, again, providing an additional guide of the substrate and how we might identify these substrates ahead of time. And then finally, talk a little bit about a recent study that was performed regarding VT ablation. This is just an algorithm of automated pace map matching, and some data that we've been working on with Biosense. And this is the induced VT and a paced VT. And you can see in this particular case, they're overlaid. One's yellow and one's green, and computer just simply overlays. You can see there's an excellent match, and it does a cross correlation in every lead, and then assigns each VT match a correlation coefficient. And one can then look very quickly at a table of pace maps and induced VTs and make a map of pace map match correlations and that sort of thing. So this is, again, just an aid so that one's not moving paper around and trying to compare a bunch of VT morphologies on paper. I think this is going to be very helpful. Hopefully this will be some version that will be coming out soon. And I want to close with, now that we've talked about the approaches to VT ablation and the ways in which we can take this from a procedure where a patient with slow, stable VT was the only one who was considered, to anybody, frankly, that has a shock, ought to be considered for VT ablation, as far as I'm concerned. And one approach that's looked at this that may also provide some rationale for this is a pilot study that was done. This is Beth Israel, Mass General, and CROG. And the question that was asked is, what if we use substrate mapping very early after a patient presents with VT? So when they get their ICD, if they've had a shock, as soon as they get one shock, they now get, instead of putting them on a drug as the first, or doing nothing, or programming their ATP, let's randomize them to VT ablation versus whatever else you want to do. So usually medical therapy. So this was to avoid angiographic drug therapy. So patients were ablated to substrate ablation or standard medical therapy. So we got ACE inhibitors, 95%, beta blockers, again, 98%, and aspirin. So they excluded patients deliberately that had lots of VT and VF because those patients needed therapy anyway, and generally got ablated or got drug therapy. And they avoided angiographic drug therapy unless the patients were already on for controlling an SVT, and they had their qualifying event. These were all secondary prevention studies: cardiac arrest, VT, syncope with induced VT. So there was a dramatic reduction in, or significant reduction in shocks and ICD events. Whether you do this as all shocks or shocks plus ATP. So medical therapy versus ablation. And interestingly, very interesting trend in a relatively short period of time in not too sick populations. These patients are much healthier than the ones that I showed you that are currently being referred for ablation. Here, there's a trend toward a decrease in overall mortality. So there's currently being planned a much larger 400-patient study of a prospective ablation study. Again, early on in the course, as soon as the patient gets an ICD, in fact, prior to the shock, substrate ablation, and one could argue this is a marked extrapolation of the data. But I think it probably is a study that needs to be done, looking at whether or not you can improve survival. It's a survival study by avoiding antiarrhythmic drug therapy and multiple shocks in patients who are getting so one can say that's a little far out there. We've now looked at the third set of randomized trial data that says that mortality, as soon as you get a single shock with an ICD, your mortality is tripled. And as you get multiple shocks, the more shocks you get, the higher your mortality is. And so everybody says, well, yeah, that's because we all know that the things that make shocks make people die. So they're sick of people. You start correcting for all of the various comorbidities, and you still come out with a significant correlation between shocks and mortality. So simply, maybe time to revise our concepts about how we treat VT, and that although ICDs have been wonderful for physicians in that patients don't die immediately from their events, they clearly die more frequently as they have more episodes of VT. And we probably need to approach that in a way that's much different than we do now. And that simply having people have a lot of events on antiarrhythmic drug therapy may actually not be the best way to go. Obviously, we won't have the answer until the results of a larger clinical trial is complete. So thanks again for your time, and I'll be happy to answer your questions.
Dave, what proportion of the patients that are receiving shocks do you think have BT as opposed to VF?
It's a
large
great
patient population, or is it a small patient?
Yeah, it's a great question. It actually turns out the vast, if you look at it, it probably depends a little bit on what population. And so you're talking about a secondary prevention population or a native 2 type population. Interestingly, if you define VT as any organized arrhythmia that has a cycle length of greater than 230 milliseconds, the majority are from VT. And interestingly, even in patients with VF, the majority are from VT. And so the real question is, what happens to patients who present with VF only with these substrate ablation therapies? And so one of the secondary goals of this trial will actually be to see whether or not these scar border ablation techniques have an impact on. There are patients that clearly present with VF only, and although there was a time when we believed that VT always preceded VF, that was sort of based on the era of drug halters that showed torsade always preceded, ventricular fibrillation. But in reality, when you look at ICD logs, there's probably a substantial minority of patients who the first event that they have is VF. There's not VT as the initial rhythm. And so the question really gets at the point is, do these techniques have any impact on primary VF? And there's no data right now on that, other than a small proportion of these patients in this trial had VF. And in the larger clinical trial, there'll be all comers VT or VF. And so can't answer the question right now, but it's an interesting one that I hope we'll have some insight as to whether that's the case. Clearly, VF that's storming is a different story. So the occasional shock for VF is one thing. As you know, VF storm may have something to do with the His-Purkinje system as triggers, and that's probably the ablation procedure for that is targeting premature beats arising from the His-Purkinje system. But that's probably a minority of the VF that we see, and I don't know. There's some interesting data that came from you guys here many years ago, where people ablated the His-Purkinje system, and that was one of your concepts, I think, that in fact may play an important role. So it'll be interesting to see, and whether or not these scar border ablation techniques can certainly have an impact on His-Purkinje conduction as well. So the short answer is no.
I was just curious, if you did voltage mapping around where the ICD lead is in the right ventricle, if you would see a low voltage area there. I was just wondering if the shocks themselves are kind of in the myocardium
Yeah, it's a good question. Well, as you know, there was some autopsy data a long time ago. The interest in this is all sort of, we all lost our interest and didn't believe that shocks were a bad thing. And as you remember, there was some data from the we were using 400 joules to defibrillate patients. Where there was some data there that kind of energy certainly was toxic to the myocardium. There was a paper by Boaz Avital about 10 years ago that looked at the myocardium from patients who died with defibrillators and did find an increased incidence of scarring around the areas where the electrodes were. But there has not been as much data more recently about that. So don't take away that defibrillators are bad things. It's just probably not a good idea to let patients have lots and lots of shocks. And so I don't want you to get the wrong impression, but I think that it's not so benign. And most of our reaction is when somebody's defibrillated by an ICD scope. Saved his life. We're really glad. But the story may be more complicated than that. The other interesting story with devices is that they can be pro-arrhythmic. I'm sure some of you guys that have been involved in IV pacing, the placement of the left ventricular lead is a very tricky thing, and there's a small group of patients, maybe 3 or 5%, when you start pacing on the lateral wall, you suddenly get all sorts of BT that you never saw before. And interestingly, we sort of, in the few patients that we've looked at, that's a pro-arrhythmic effect that's related to probably to pacing. There were some slow conduction channels that were on the lateral border of the scar that were engaged very readily by posterior wall pacing. But that's sort of a little different thing, and that happens on the occasion. So I think I don't want to overdo the potential negative effects of shocks, but I think we've so cast it out of our mind that that's a bad thing that I think it's important to start thinking about it again.
What's to keep you from just going in a circle around the scar?
There's no reason not to do that. It just takes a minute. So there are people that have proposed that. In fact, Giordano had the encircling ventriculotomy was one of the first things they did. Unfortunately, it was a procedure that had been done surgically at a high mortality, as you might imagine. So what they did is replaced it with an encircling cryo or encircling small incision, partial ventriculotomy. Those had more acceptable mortality rates. There have been some patients where they've had multiple morphologies, and we haven't been able to get the pace maps that we wanted, and we have encircled the whole scar, but it's really been a minority. They've tolerated the procedure well, but you have to realize there may be other reasons why you don't get good pace maps on the endocardial. But you could take that approach. And in fact, there's a paper that just came out from the Mayo Clinic not too long ago where that they advocated that as a strategy that would avoid pace mapping and doing anything else. Just get in there, define the scar, and play it all the way around. It just takes time.
But how much more time? I don't have a sense.
Okay. And what we've done, we actually have been measuring the scar circumference to get some idea. So our average ablation is about 30% of the scar circumference is what it requires in sort of short segments. And so part of the reason is that if you use open irrigation, you get fluid, and you get a fair volume of fluid, so you want to limit that. So one of the things, so probably would add another hour to RF. So I think that would be, so that's not impossible, it's just, you probably use more energy than we want to do. More than we need.
Another question I have is, it seems like from your talk, ischemic BT is always reentry, and there isn't much room for your automaticity. And would that be different for non-ischemic?
Yeah, no. First of all, your question is very good, and in fact, it's important to point out that probably even for ischemic BT, about 10% are focal and can't be trained, and presumably some of these are either some sort of automaticity or they're triggered activity. So I think it's there. It's just clearly the minority. And the only reason I can say that is that if you use entrainment and a whole variety of other relatively specific markers for reentry, that in fact you can have those fulfilled in about 90% of the BTs. But in fairness, probably about 10% are focal. And those may be some of the BTs we're missing because not everybody's cured, and that may be some of the reasons. So we do, in some of these folks, give high-dose isoprel and Fortunately, one of the things that is nice about pacing is that it does reproduce. You know, you can get triggered VTs with pacing and isoprel and that sort of thing, so it is possible to break some of these out. The second point that you raised, though, is also important, which is there's clearly a difference in mechanism for non-ischemic VT, much more non-reentral mechanisms. And Steve Huxley, the work from that you've done here in St. Louis, has, I think, very dramatically made that point. And I think it's borne out in clinical studies that not only are they more often endocardial, but they're more often non-reentral. So, do these methods work as well for non-ischemic myopathy? Well, it's first of all, you don't reproduce the BT as often, so that's a real problem. You can't get a template. And when patients come in with ICD shocks, you don't have anything to target because you don't know 12 minutes, so you can't really be sure where they're coming from. So these are all potential issues with the non-ischemic patients. We try to use these same methods that we do with ischemics, and the only thing that's different is we simultaneously map the endocardial from the outset of the patients that have non-ischemic cardiomyopathy. There's so many of the mechanisms. Thank you.
Any other questions? Thank you again.